So let's talk about the holiday of Chanukkah. We talked about the history of Chanukkah, and now let's talk about the holiday of Chanukkah. Chanukkah as a holiday was never going to exist. Never, ever going to exist. I'll tell you why it was never going to exist. That family that I talked about, the Maccabees, the Hashmonean, when they took over the temple and won the war against the Greek Empire, they did something that was a heresy at the time. They took over the temple and therefore the priesthood. They assigned the priesthood to themselves, and because they had won the war, they also assigned themselves the kingship. And up until that moment, in 800 years of Jewish history, there had always been a separation of church and state. It wasn't invented in the 1700s. And it was critical, like our nation, our people saw that it was critical that the kingship must and needed to be separate from the priesthood. But the Hashmonean family didn't care about the rules of the land and took upon itself to rule on both sides. And that was a big no-no. So it drew a lot of, opposition to their rule because of that. And because of the opposition to their rule was never really stable. There was always some conflict. They tried to police the land, but the revolt that had started with them kind of continued against them. There was real unrest in the land. And because of that, and because they started to see that they were not going to be able to quench the little rebellions that were happening here and there, they made a huge mistake. They invited to come in and help them the Roman armies that were stationed just north of the land of Israel. They thought, we're going to have the armies of the Romans, and they're going to help us rule over the land. We're going to make a deal with them. We'll keep ourselves in power, and they're going to be kind of our police for us. Can you imagine? The Romans were like, what? You're inviting us to conquer you? We don't even have to do anything? Okay. Pace Romana. And so they walked in, and of course they walked in and they took everything over. They managed to strike deals with the Hashmonean, and what happened was the Hashmonean family began to, in fact, argue amongst themselves at who will be able to bribe the Roman generals the most in order to keep themselves in power. So every few months there was a new ruler over the land because suddenly there was more money available, and that's how the rulers changed. Now you have to understand that the Roman invasion is going to be the one historical event that is going to be the most devastating to our people. We estimate that at the time of the Roman invasion, there were about 4 million Jews in the land of Israel. 4 million of us in the whole land of Israel. By the time the Second Temple is destroyed in 70 CE, and the Jews are dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, there is only 1 million of us left. The Romans killed 3/4 of our people. 1 out of 3 Jews were massacred, crucified, just a horrible bloodbath. And that created multiple rebellions throughout the time that the Romans were there, obviously. Some very famous, like the one of Bar Kokhba, but others. When the Jews who survived saw the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of the Jewish people, those Jews, those learned Jews, decided that they wanted to save Judaism. And in order to save Judaism, they had to reinvent Judaism. It was no longer be a religion based on the land and the temple. They had to have a portable religion. They made the Torah the center of our tradition, and they created a new form of Judaism that could be practiced in Spain as much as in Paris or in Rome. And that's called Rabbinic Judaism. It's the evolution of Rabbinic Judaism is what we are still practicing to this day. Rabbinic Judaism is going to take about 1,000 years to congeal, really, with the Talmud and then different other works from different rabbis. And it's going to take about 1,000 years to kind of become what we've come to know as Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis of the time were obviously, as you can imagine, fierce opponent to the Hashmonean family. They were those who actually rose in rebellion against them. They were fierce opponent of them. They were never, ever going to include the story of the Hashmonean in the canon of Judaism. In fact, the book of Maccabees are not part of the Torah. They are not part of the Tanakh. They are not anywhere to be found. They're just not there. And the reason is they wanted to erase them. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. Forget about Chanukkah. We don't want to have any remembrance of this awful family that devastated our nation, that caused the murder of so many of our families and our tribes. The problem, though, is that 1 million survivors who lived through pagan times for a long time kept on celebrating this weird festival of light. At the end at the beginning of winter, in the middle of winter, on the 25th of Kislev, they kept doing it. We kept telling them to stop, but you couldn't stop. It's something that they had done for so many generations that they kept on celebrating this festival of light. So after some time, the rabbis decided, if you can't beat them, join them. So they went and started a conversation, it's actually in the Talmud, about, like one of the rabbis asked, Mahi Chanukkah? What's Chanukkah? Guys, we got to do something about that. And so they went back and invented and made up the whole story of the jar that was found in the basement of the temple, and this just one little jar of oil that was only going to last one day, but they knew that historically the celebration was 8, and so they created and made up this miracle that happened, that little jar of oil that was supposed to last one day, in fact, lasted 8. And now they reintegrating this pagan holiday of the Festival of Light and making it, because they have to, because their parishioners are celebrating. And so they're reframing the story, they're reframing the holiday, they're telling everybody to buy Chanukiot. We're going to do it differently than just bonfires. It's going to be in our homes because it has to be portable, it has to be done anywhere and everywhere, right? And so they create this holiday out of nothing, out of thin air. They made up this miracle and tell us now, this is your holiday. Now, the 25th of Kislev is very close to the 25th of December, and it will be this year, obviously. I'm thinking it was very close at the time as well. In Rome, the 25th of December was the birthday of the unconquerable sun. Tomorrow is winter solstice. Tomorrow is the shortest day of the year. And for 3 days, for the next 3 days, the sun is going to be at its lowest on the horizon. In fact, the sun will stand still. It will look like the sun is completely standing still. It's been going down, 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 and up until tomorrow. And then on the 25th of December, it's going to start slightly rising back up. Hence the holiday of Christmas. The rising of the new sun, whatever you want to call it, is exactly in connection to the pagan Roman holiday of the celebration of the unconquerable sun. It's not a mistake that this was chosen. It's not a mistake that Chanukkah also happens at this time of the year. The sun is at its lowest, and our holidays are based on the moon, right? So the 8 days of Chanukkah are from the 25th of Kislev, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30, and then 2 candles as the sun, so the moon is waning, it's coming darker and darker and darker and darker and darker, and the last 2 days, the moon comes back. There's a thin silver of the moon that starts again. So it's the same story, right? The sun rising again, and then the moon rising again. And so the candles of Chanukkah are bringing light at the darkest time of the year. And so is the story and the celebration of the sun god in Rome. So Chanukkah was and has always been a very minor holiday, despite the fact that the rabbis did some contortionism in order to make it a holiday. It was always a very minor holiday, not to be celebrated, really. I mean, when I grew up in France, we lit the candles and that was it. There was nothing else that happened. It became an interesting to the Jews who started to live in the land of Israel. And in their needing to creating a myth around the rebirth of Israel in our ancestral land. And they loved the story of the Maccabees. They took on the story of the Maccabees and they kind of adopted that story of the Jews in their own land that struggled for independence, right? And so because of Israel, the holiday of Hanukkah about 100 years ago was kind of revived. And then, when the holiday of Christmas became a time of shopping and consumption in the last few decades, it became really hard for the Jewish families to compete. Right? Christmas became very attractive to the kids. And so the gift giving that happened, that is just really a few decades old, maybe a generation old, is in fact in contrast to the holiday of Christmas. But that is not actually at all part of the holiday. I lived in France all my youth. I lived in Israel for 10 years. There is no exchange of gifts during Hanukkah. Now, why 8 candles? Well, not why 8 candles. We know why 8 candles, because of the little jar of oil that lasted for the whole time. But there's an argument between the rabbis in the Talmud. If we're going to celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah and make this holiday up, we should actually be closer to what we're pretending happened at the time of the miracle. Meaning that if there was 1 jar of oil on the first day, and the whole Chanukkah, the whole menorah of the temple was lit, and it continued burning the second day, and then the third day, we can imagine that though there was still burning, which was a miracle, we can imagine that it was not as bright the second day as the first one, and then not as bright the third day as the second one, and so on and so on and so on, right? So some of the rabbis are arguing that in fact we should start with 8 candles, and then decreased to 7 and to 6 and to 5 and to 4, all the way to 1, so that it will be closer to what we are pretending the story of what happened. It makes more sense. If you want to really, anchor that story in the minds of people, you want to kind of try to make it real. Obviously, that's not what we're doing. So those who argued for that lost their argument completely. And one of the reasons they lost the argument is one of the rabbis said, sure, you could do that, but the kids are not going to like it. Literally. Like, that's one of the arguments. The kids are not going to do it, so again, if you can't beat them, join them. So it's just not going to work. Like, people are going to want to have more light, not less light. That's not going to work. The second argument, which is actually the one who won the day, was that think about what it is that you are celebrating. Because what you are celebrating is not whether the authenticity of the made-up story that we're telling is true or not. That's not relevant. What we're celebrating really is that miracle, right? It's the miracle we are celebrating. That's what we want to instill in the celebration of that holiday. And the miracle was bigger the second day. And then even bigger the third day. It was even more mind-blowing that it was still going on the fourth day. So if you're going to celebrate the miracle, you have to increase the light. And anyways, there is a rule, there is a tradition that's very important to Judaism, is that you can only increase in holiness. That's kind of one of the rules of the halakha. Whatever you do in your life, you're only allowed to increase in holiness. Meaning that, let's say that you just bought a house. By the time you are ready to sell a house, you can only increase in holiness. You have to make that house more beautiful by the time you sell it than the time you found it. You can never decrease in holiness. There were homes in Israel when the Jews started to come back to Jerusalem that over time had become whorehouses. And rabbis went and bought those homes to transform them into yeshivas. They went specifically to buy those homes, to make them into yeshivas, because you can only increase in holiness. All our lives, whatever we are doing, whatever we seek to create is only as to increase in holiness, of beautifying the world, of making our lives better and bigger. So, that's for the holiday of Chanukkah. And we'll talk about the Kabbalah of Chanukkah in a moment.